All right, let's jump right in. We're taking a deep dive into Matthew 14 today.
Sounds good.
It's a chapter that's packed with a lot, really.
Yeah.
It's got drama and miracles.
Right.
Even some, seriously challenging moments for Jesus' disciples.
Absolutely, yeah.
You sent me some great sources for this. Notes, articles, even like a sermon transcript, which is a very interesting take. But it seems like we're all focusing on one thing, what this chapter tells us about faith, miracles, and following Jesus,
Following Jesus through the good and the bad.
Yeah, through thick and thin, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the first story in Matthew 14.
Okay.
It always leaves me with, a chill.
Really?
Yeah. So we've got John the Baptist, this incredibly bold prophet, gets imprisoned by Herod. And the reason?
Yeah, why?
Because John dared to call out Herod's immoral relationship with his brother's wife.
Wow.
Talk about speaking truth to power.
I mean, that takes some guts.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
It's a powerful reminder that following Jesus isn't always,
Yeah, it's not always sunshine and roses.
No, it's not always a comfortable path.
Right.
Sometimes it requires us to, stand firm on what we believe in. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Even when it puts us at odds with those in authority.
Yeah.
And, that can come at a cost.
Yeah. Big time.
Yeah. I've always wondered about Herod's internal struggle in that situation. One of the sources I read highlighted how Herod actually knew John was a good guy. He even
We liked him.
he enjoyed listening to him preach.
Wow. Okay.
But in the end, he chose to silence John rather than, risk upsetting Herodias or appearing weak in front of his guests.
Yeah, that's hard. It's like he knew in his heart that John was right, but he just couldn't bring himself to
do the right thing.
To do the right thing. Yeah. Fear and pride, man, they can be so powerful. It can be so easy to compromise what we believe in when we're more concerned with our image or, our position than doing the right thing.
Yeah, than doing what we know is right.
Exactly.
And the setting for John's execution is just so jarring to me. I mean, you've got this lavish birthday party, everyone's celebrating, and then in walks Herodias' daughter, and she performs this dance that pleases Herod so much that, he makes this rash promise.
It's almost like he got caught up in the moment. Like he wasn't thinking clearly.
Oh, yeah.
And, that detail about the promise is so significant. It really shows how quickly things can spiral, especially when our motivations aren't pure.
Right.
Herod was caught in a web of his own making,
That's a good story.
Driven by pride and lust. And ultimately, an innocent man paid the price.
An innocent man paid the price.
That's right.
It's a sobering reminder. Standing for truth can have serious consequences, but it also challenges us.
It challenges us to think about what we're willing to risk.
Yeah. What are we willing to risk for our faith?
Yeah.
Where do we need to find that boldness, that same boldness that John displayed, even when it feels, risky?
Even when it feels dangerous?
Uncomfortable. Yeah, even when it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah. It might not be as dramatic as, confronting a king or anything.
Right.
But we all face those situations where we need to choose between what's popular and what's right.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Whether it's, speaking up against injustice.
Right.
Or refusing to participate in gossip.
Yeah.
Or simply living our lives with integrity even when nobody's watching. Those everyday decisions are what really shape us,
They really do. They really shape our character.
They do.
Okay, so let's shift gears to a story that feels totally different in tone, but I think still speaks to the challenges of following Jesus.
Okay.
The feeding of the 5,000. It's hard to wrap your mind around the sheer logistics of it all. We're talking 5,000 men, plus women and children. A massive crowd gathered out in the middle of nowhere.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's a story that highlights, I think, both the human need and Jesus' divine response.
Yeah, it's like these people were hungry, tired, and they were looking to Jesus for something more than just, a meal.
Yeah, they were looking for something deeper, weren't they?
They were looking for spiritual guidance, hope, healing, and Jesus, just moved by compassion, chose to meet them right where they were.
Right, where they were. And it's not just that Jesus fed them, it's how he did it.
Right.
This wasn't a catering service. It was a miracle. I mean, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I mean, resources that seem totally inadequate.
Definitely not enough food for a crowd that big.
Not even close.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus takes what they have, gives thanks, and somehow it multiplies to feed everyone. I mean, everyone.
That's incredible. You know, some of the commentaries you sent pointed out that the disciples initially wanted to, like, send the crowds away.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like, they saw the problem, the scarcity, and their immediate reaction was like, well, we can't do anything about this. Let's just send them home.
Interesting. So they focused on the problem.
Yeah. But Jesus had a different perspective, you know?
Yeah.
He saw an opportunity to, like, reveal his glory,
Yeah.
to demonstrate his power over nature, and to provide for his people in a way that would, you know, leave no doubt about who he was.
But I love that there were even leftovers.
Oh, yeah, me too. It's
Yeah.
such a great detail. It speaks to the abundance of God's provision. It's like, he doesn't just meet our needs, he goes above and beyond.
He exceeds them. He exceeds them. But here's the thing that really strikes me. In the midst of this incredible display of power, Jesus took the time to give thanks. That detail should not be overlooked.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even in the midst of performing miracles, Jesus remained grounded in gratitude. He recognized that everything he had came from God. And I think that's a powerful lesson for us, isn't it? I mean, it's so easy to focus on what we lack, you know, to be consumed by our problems and to forget all the ways God has already blessed us.
It really is. And like cultivating a heart of gratitude, even in the midst of challenges, can totally change our perspective, you know?
Yeah.
It lets us see the abundance that's already there in our lives and to trust that God will keep providing for us.
Even when we can't see how.
Even when we can't see how.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's incredible.
It is. Yeah. It's, you know, it really is like that saying, gratitude turns what we have into enough.
Yeah.
And speaking of enough, let's move on to that third story in Matthew 14.
Okay.
This one takes us to a stormy sea at night.
Oh, yeah.
The disciples are out in a boat battling the wind and the waves when suddenly they see this figure walking towards them on the water.
Yeah. Talk about a spooky situation. In my notes, it says they actually thought it was a ghost at first.
I mean, I guess that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they were exhausted.
Yeah.
Probably terrified. And then this figure just appears out of nowhere.
It's like a classic scene of fear turning into awe, you know?
Wow.
They thought they were all alone out there in that storm, but then Jesus just shows up in this totally unexpected way.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the point, isn't it? He's always there, even when we can't see him, even when we feel like we're sinking.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. And then there's Peter. You know, he's always good for a dramatic moment. In a burst of, I don't know, faith, adrenaline, he calls out to Jesus and asks to walk on the water too.
What's so fascinating to me is that Jesus actually says, come.
Right.
He invites Peter to like step out of the boat and into the impossible.
Yeah.
And for a minute, Peter actually does it. He's walking on water, but then he takes his eyes off of Jesus, you know, starts focusing on the storm raging around him, and he starts to sink.
That visual always gets me. It's that moment where doubt just creeps in and suddenly what seemed possible, you know, becomes totally overwhelming. I think we can all relate to that feeling, can't we?
Oh, absolutely.
Those moments where we start out strong, full of faith, full of determination, but then life throws a curveball and we lose our footing.
It's like one of the articles you shared talked about Peter's story as like a metaphor for the Christian life.
Okay.
You know, there are those seasons where we feel like we're walking on water,
Right.
where our faith is strong and we're experiencing God's power in amazing ways. But then there's always those inevitable storms.
Right.
Those times when doubt and fear threaten to overwhelm us.
So how do we stay afloat in those storms? How do we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus when the wind and the waves are crashing all around us?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I think, well, it starts with recognizing that doubt is a normal part of the faith journey.
Okay.
You know, it doesn't mean we're weak or that we've somehow failed. It just means we're human. Even the disciples, the ones who like walked and talked with Jesus.
Right. They were right there with him.
They experienced moments of doubt too.
And like you said earlier, Jesus doesn't condemn us for our doubts.
Right.
He meets us in those moments with compassion and grace. Remember, Peter cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand. He didn't hesitate. You know, he didn't say, well, you should have had more faith. He responded to Peter's need.
That's such an encouraging truth. It reminds us that no matter how many times we stumble or fall, no matter how deep our doubts may run, Jesus is always there, ready to extend a hand of mercy and pull us back up.
It's like he's saying, I've got you. Just keep your eyes on me.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, what does that actually look like? How do we shift our focus back to Jesus when we're, in the middle of the storm?
Well, one really practical step is to, surround ourselves with people who can remind us of God's truth, especially when we're struggling to see it ourselves, That sermon transcript you included, it talked about the importance of Christian community. We weren't meant to go through these storms alone. We need each other to offer encouragement, prayer, and accountability.
It's like having a life raft in the middle of a raging sea.
Right, totally.
Those people who can help us stay afloat when we feel like we're sinking. And sometimes just hearing someone else's story of how God carried them through a difficult time can give us the hope and strength to keep going.
Oh, absolutely. Sharing our struggles and victories with each other, it helps to build faith.
Right.
And reminds us that we're not alone in this journey.
Yeah, we're not alone. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about standing for truth even when it's hard, about trusting in God's abundance, and about finding hope in the middle of storms. But I'm curious, from all the sources you've read, is there a common thread that runs through these three stories, like a takeaway that really stands out to you?
What strikes me is that in each story, we see the disciples facing situations that seem impossible. They're outnumbered, out-resourced, and completely outmatched. But in every case, Jesus steps in and does the miraculous.
Right.
He empowers them to speak truth to power. He provides for their needs in abundance, and he rescues them from the storm.
So it's not about our ability, it's about his power working through us.
Right.
I like that. It kind of takes the pressure off, doesn't it? It's not about us having all the answers or figuring everything out on our own. It's about surrendering to God's plan.
Yeah.
And trusting that he's got this.
And that surrender, that trust, that's where faith comes in.
Yeah.
It's not the absence of doubt. It's choosing to believe, even when we don't fully understand, even when things look bleak. John the Baptist, he didn't know how his imprisonment was going to end.
Right.
But he trusted God's purpose. The disciples didn't see how 5 loaves could feed thousands, but they followed Jesus' lead.
Right.
And Peter, even when he started to sink, he cried out to Jesus for help.
That's a powerful way to frame it. It's not about having perfect faith. It's about taking that step of faith, even if it's, a shaky one, and knowing that Jesus will meet us there. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Matthew 14, what's one practical thing our listeners can take away from these stories? Something they can apply to their lives this week?
One of the commentaries you sent talked about how each of these stories involves a choice. John the Baptist chose to speak truth despite the consequences.
Right.
The disciples chose to trust Jesus with the little they had. Peter chose to step out of the boat even though he was afraid. And I think that's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah.
What choices are we making in our lives that reflect our faith in Jesus?
So it's not just about reading these stories and feeling inspired. It's about letting them shape our actions, our decisions.
Exactly.
It's about taking that step of faith.
Yeah.
Even when it feels risky. Even when we're not sure of the outcome.
Exactly. Because it's in those moments of choice, those moments when we step out in faith, that we truly experience the power of God working in and through our lives.
This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us dig deep into Matthew 14.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing these familiar stories with fresh eyes.
It's always great to explore scripture with you.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've been encouraged and challenged to live out your faith with boldness, trust, and a willingness to, step out of that boat, even when the water looks a little rough.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep diving deep.